Following order, actually not in the, I'm just going to take the order from Drissa, Mbye, Sylvie, Wanjiru, and Cameron. Let me say just briefly a few things about the panelists. They're all friends of mine, so my introduction is going to be informal. Drissa Toure is a filmmaker from Burkina Faso, has a film in the festival, Haramuya, and has made films before that. One African popular filmmakers. So, you know, he, in that sense, is quite important for the panel. Mbye Cham teaches at Howard University. Along with Clyde, I think Mbye has done more on the popularization of African cinema in this country than anybody else. Has written extensively on African cinema and has trained many students on African cinema at Howard University. And also has organized some of the original festivals on African cinema, African American cinema, and Caribbean cinema in this country, aside from being author of 2 books in that field. Sylvie Kande is my colleague at New York University. She teaches Francophone literature, African literature, Caribbean literature. She's in Africana Studies and French department at NYU. So you have a very important resource at hand in New York here. So that I'm quite happy that she's here, that I'm able to introduce her to you so you can come to her office at Africana Studies from now on and take all her time. Wanjiru Kinyanjui met her first time in Ouagadougou. That's the place to meet all the African filmmakers, and I have been quite impressed with her ever since. She has a film also in this festival. She was based. So he has been working very hard. I've known him now for more than 10 years, working very hard at making African cinema, Black European cinema, and African American cinema known in Canada. So he is quite important also in the domain of African cinema, and I met him again for the first time in Ouagadougou. So this is probably a way of saying that you should go to Ouagadougou too next time and meet me, and perhaps I will introduce you at the panel here. So perhaps, you know, we are here to talk about the African cultures, popular cultures, and cinema, the way in which cinema participate in popular culture, in that discourse. So maybe I should let Drissa talk, and then if I have to translate, I'll translate, and then we just go like that. People take maybe about 10 minutes, or if you want to take less, you can take less. 10 minutes, plus ou moins.
Je vais d'abord vous remercier le festival à travers donc Marine Bonetti et ses collaborateurs et collaboratrices qui m'ont permis quand même de découvrir New York.
So I must first of all thank the festival, Mahane Bonetti, Dan, and their collaborators for giving me the opportunity to come to New York and meet with you all here.
Et je vous remercie vous aussi d'être indulgent parce que je suis un peu décalé parce que bon, je viens d'arriver.
I also thank you for your indulgence because I have jet lag. I just got here, so yeah.
Bon, par rapport à la culture populaire, pour moi, tout de suite à chaud dans ma mémoire, je vois ma grand-mère qui me raconte des histoires.
Perhaps the starting point for me in talking about popular culture, is to let you know that my grandmother come to my mind right away.
Et c'est toujours imagé. C'est le loup, l'agneau, l'hyène, le lièvre. Voilà, c'est le lièvre.
So this comes into image through folk tales, as you see the hare, the hyena, the lions, and as all these animals basically populate African folklore.
Donc on sait que les animaux et les oiseaux qu'on choisit, c'est pas des humains, mais il y a des psychologies, il y a une morale qui se dégage, et par rapport à cela, moi quand je suis rentré dans le cinéma, ça m'a pas causé de problème.
So we know that the animals, the birds that are used in these folk tales are not human beings, but the moral of the story relate to human beings. So when I went to cinema, it did not create much problem for me to make the transition.
Voilà, donc quand j'ai commencé donc à écrire mes scénarios, à regarder la ville, le village, j'ai vu effectivement dans ma mémoire quand ma grand-mère me disait qu'il y avait des hommes et des femmes, il y a des aigles, il y a des moutons, il y a des béliers, et dans la psychologie des personnages, que ce soit en Afrique, en Europe, je vois à peu près ce genre de personnages dans ma vie, imagés comme ça.
So when I began to make films on the city, on villages, I saw my grandmother as she used to say they are men, they are women, and then she used to image this through, through different animals in the folk tales, and I could form my characters by basing them on the lion, the ram, and different animals that used to stand for different characterization in African folklore. And I use this now, whether I'm right, I'm talking about Africans or Europeans in my films, so this is my basis.
Donc en maîtrisant cette base culturelle depuis la famille, et quand on rencontre l'universel, on n'a pas peur.
So when you control, when you master this cultural base, when you come to cinema, you come to art, and the transition to the universal no longer scares you.
Pour le moment, je pourrais m'arrêter là en attendant vos réactions et la contribution des autres.
So I will stop here for the time being and wait for your reaction to this and also your reaction to the contribution of my other panelists. So, Mr. Mbye Cham.
Thank you, Manthia. And do I have to turn anything on here?
No,
This
you
is on. Okay. I also want to say thank you to Mahen and Don and everybody who's involved in the organization of this festival, especially this panel here, for letting me be a part of this discussion this afternoon. I want to explore two basic issues here, not in any detail, but maybe to just sound them out as a beginning and then throw it out as a basis for discussion further on at the end. And these issues revolve around the questions of self-conception of the African filmmaker, the ways that they define themselves vis-a-vis some of the figures, the artistic figures that predate their practice within their individual and respective traditions. And in this particular case, I'm referring to the figure of the griot, or the storyteller, to whom many filmmakers in particular tend to position themselves vis-a-vis, as sources of inspiration, for example, in providing self-definitions, self-conceptions of themselves as artists, operating within a modern-day medium, this medium of cinema, for example. I mean, what I'm talking about is also to a large extent applicable to people using the medium of writing, African writers. These are some issues that have been written about and debated in African writing. But I'm extracting some of those ideas from that particular area to apply them to cinema. And secondly, I want to highlight some of the tendencies in African cinema as far as the modalities of engagement with the oral traditions are concerned. How do the African filmmakers, beyond defining themselves vis-a-vis the griots and the storytellers, how do they actually, in their works, deploy the oral traditions? How do they contain, how do these oral traditions exist inside their works? So these are the two areas that I want to highlight, and maybe in talking about the second area regarding their modalities of engagement, I might be able to also problematize the notion of the oral traditions as a locus of authenticity, what impels some of the filmmakers to look at the oral traditions as this locus that would, as this locus of authenticity. Let me leave it at that. But in general, if one looks at the pronouncements of African filmmakers and African writers in general, it is very, very frequent that one encounters statements along the lines of them claiming certain aspects of their indigenous traditional artistic canons as paradigms or models or sources of inspiration that they use in various ways, not only to inform not only the form and content of their work, but also the very conception of themselves as artists in society. And this is particularly true of the African filmmaker who sets out to consciously lay part of the foundation of his or her work on certain aspects of the aesthetic heritage of his or her society, notwithstanding the use of a colonially inherited medium such as language or vehicles such as film. Now, for some artists, this process of conflating the indigenous oral traditions, that is, these indigenous resources from the oral traditions, usually in the form of proverbs, oral narratives, and idioms, characters, culture motifs, some of the things that Drissa had pointed out. This process of conflating the indigenous with the non-indigenous becomes for them an act of literary authenticity, which is clearly meant or intended to put an imprint of legitimate Africanness on their work. Whilst for others, the union of the indigenous with the non-indigenous is contracted not in the name of authenticity per se, but rather in the name of artistic appropriateness and effectiveness. It's a mechanism for them to solve certain problems that are confronted, that they confront within a given work in the process of constructing a given work. And as a result, resorting to these resources of the tradition provides them those tools and the wherewithal to solve those artistic problems. So that in the second case, that is these latter filmmakers for me, their work tends to go beyond the limitations of authenticity of this quest for Africanness, and therefore tend to go beyond much of the labels of exotica and so on and so forth that, in my mind, tend to characterize perhaps those in the first category. I'm not trying to set up any fixed categories here, but I'm just evoking these as a means of talking about what I see happening on the scene. Let me take, first of all, the self-conception of the artists, the ways that they define themselves vis-a-vis other artists in their traditions, and talk about this figure of the griot that is usually held up as the model by many, many African filmmakers in particular. Now, in my own society, which is from the Senegambia area in West Africa, the figure of the griot is somewhat of a paradox in that society, in that that society is structured on a caste system. There's a hierarchical structure that defines the society, and it's one that is based on this notion of caste. And the griot comes from one of the casted categories. So in a way, the griot is a paradox in my society in that the caste system assigns him or her an inferior position within that social hierarchy. But on the other hand, his profession as a griot, that is his mastery of language, his knowledge, the control that he has of certain knowledge of a historical, social, traditional nature, okay, accords him one of the most important and influential positions within the political as well as social circles of power, prestige, and wealth. So on the one hand, his social position is very, very low in the hierarchy, but on the other hand, the qualifications, that is his skills, his communicative skills, his performance skills, and so on and so forth, sort of negate or tend to mitigate or counter that social positioning. The griot is stigmatized in my society socially precisely because of his or her profession, yet it is the same profession that grants him access to and influence over the supposedly social and political superiors. And these supposedly social and political superiors, who are usually in the noble caste, that are in the upper castes, usually need, in their quest to maintain certain ideals, certain demands of their caste code of conduct, they necessarily need the services of the griot. For example, one of the injunctions or one of the no-nos of the noble caste is this, what is perceived to be loudness. You are not supposed to be loud at all in public. Even in addressing an audience, you are not supposed to, your nobility does not allow you to get up and directly address an audience. You have to do it through a medium, and that medium becomes the griot. And you can see the ways in which in some films, for example, this particular code is deployed. I'm thinking here of Danny Kuyate's Skater in particular. Some of you who have seen it will see this particular code operationalized in that way. Yeah. So that the griot's control over the word and over historical and social knowledge places him in a relationship of mutual dependency with social superiors. He needs the patronage of these social superiors as much as they need his services as an artist, as a communicator, as a teacher, as a diplomat. Hence, the gewel or the griot himself or herself has a conception that is radically at odds with the definitions that are imposed on him or her by the society at large. Now, in my society, there's also another category of performer, which is a little bit different from the griot, although there are certain areas in which they overlap. And this other figure is the one that perhaps would respond to the level of the storyteller. We call them Leepkat in Wolof, as opposed to the gewel. You have the gewel, who is the griot, and the lebkat, who is the storyteller. And I don't want to take up too much time in explicating the distinctions between these two, but in general, any individual in the society can potentially be a lebkat, a storyteller, in that to be a storyteller requires little more than well-tuned ears, sharp eyes, and a good memory whilst growing up in society, because you grow up hearing these stories told to you, and over time you develop a repertoire that you can also use to do your own performances. Now, on the other hand, to be a gewel or to be a griot requires, in addition to these requirements of the lebkat, that is well-tuned ears, sharp eyes, and good memory, it requires long period of training and apprenticeship and practice in certain crucial skills and areas of society that are usually outside of the province of the lebkat. Some griots argue that the griot is one who is endowed not only with verbal and non-verbal skills, but also with what they call in my language ham-ham, which is knowledge. And it's the knowledge of a specific social, historical, and cultural and traditional nature. Now, such mastery over the word and knowledge makes the griot a central figure in the society, so that in some cases, the griots will not look kindly upon individuals who will call them a storyteller. So there's this care that they take to do these distinctions, to maintain those distinctions. Now, the interesting thing in relation to African filmmakers is that when it comes to their self-definitions, these distinctions between the lebkat and the griots tend to collapse, so that the filmmaker not only sees himself or herself as the equivalent, the modern-day equivalent of the griot, but also the modern-day equivalent of the storyteller. So that when Sembène, for example, calls himself a griot conteur, then we begin to see the ways in which these two categories collapse in his particular case. So there is this desire and also very, very prominent characteristic of their self-definitions, which invariably all filmmakers use to position themselves vis-a-vis the traditional storytellers. They look upon themselves as the modern-day equivalents, the continuation of the traditional storytellers. Now, they don't always, their relationships with the traditions sort of differ. There's some levels of variations which will become clear when I talk about the second category here, the second issue that I want to look at, which is the tendencies in African cinema regarding the ways in which filmmakers engage aspects of their traditions. How do the filmmakers locate their works in relation to the various artistic resources of their individual traditions? Now, basically, I see two main tendencies, although some have identified four, but I have tried to collapse these into two main tendencies. And here I am looking at some of the thinking on this by a Nigerian scholar. His name is Isidore Okpehu, who has written quite extensively on oral literature in Africa. And in his thinking regarding the relationship of the African writer to the oral traditions, Okpehu has identified four tendencies, which he calls one, the observation, preservation, refinement, and revision. Okay. Observation, preservation, refinement, and revision. But I choose to collapse the observation and preservation category into one and simply refer to it as preservation, this tendency to preserve the oral traditions on film in various ways. And the next two categories, refinement and revision, I have collapsed into a category entitled simply revision, in which goes well beyond simply an attempt to preserve the traditions. Now, briefly, since my time is running out here, I want to look at these two tendencies. In this category of preservation, the tendency is for the filmmaker to translate the tales in a new medium. They simply take a given oral narrative, a given story from the narrative, and simply retell it in another medium. Of course, as some of us know, I mean, it's not simply a mere transference. There's always something that happens in this process of transference, because usually when the context of enunciation changes from one medium to the other, I think there's always something that changes along there. But in general, what I'm trying to point out here is this general tendency on the part of some filmmakers to merely position themselves in a relationship with the oral tradition, in which they merely take a particular narrative, a particular story, and simply transpose it to film, so that the entire film is really about this particular narrative, this particular pre-existing text that is taken from the tradition. Some of the films, early films of Paulin Vieira, for example, from Senegal, respond to this particular category here, where he looks at some of the tales that are taken from Birago Diop's collection, the tales of Amadou Koumba, and transpose those into cinema. There's another aspect of films within this category of preservation, and that is those films that may not really be a retelling of one particular narrative, but it may be a story that is told, but within that story there is inserted within that story aspects of oral narrative performance. And this is a tendency that I think we find very much in many, many films, where within the narrative we encounter a lot of storytelling sessions that are inserted within those narratives. Now, the basic feature of this category of preservation is one of perhaps a bondage towards tradition. Okay, you simply take materials from the tradition and translate it into film, and the assumption is that by doing so, one is continuing the tradition in another medium, and therefore one is reproducing the authenticity, the Africanness of the work, and by extension, one might also assume there that the film becomes an African film, so to speak. But I would argue that there are certain limitations in this particular notion of simply preserving some of these items from the oral traditions, and that really the more interesting and perhaps productive relationship that exists between the African filmmaker and the traditions is the one that takes place under this category I label as revision, which is perhaps the one that we encounter more and more in much of the works that are coming out of African filmic practice. And here, the tendency is not simply to have this relationship of bondage, so to speak, fidelity to the letter of tradition, but rather there is an attempt to liberate oneself, to take liberties, so to speak, from some of the strictures of the tradition. And there is also much more orientation towards reinvention, towards invention, appropriating motifs and structures, more importantly, from these traditions of storytelling, from these traditions of performance, adapting these to the requirements of the new medium to construct narratives that talk about contemporary needs and challenges in Africa. And I will here simply mention the films that perhaps respond to this category here. One is the film from Cote d'Ivoire by Kramolansine Fadika entitled Jelly. Jelly, in fact, in the Malinke language means a griot. And in that particular film, Fadika not only engages in an attempt to discuss the etiology of the griot, that is the origin of this griot caste, how that relationship between the griot and the nobles came to be about. But he also uses the griot as a mechanism for telling the story about the persistence of caste and some of the problems that adherence to caste poses to young people trying to fashion a different perspective on life in contemporary Cote d'Ivoire in particular. There are numerous other films that perhaps respond to this particular designation. Yelen by Suleiman Sisse, Keita, Gimba by Sheikh Umar Sissoko, and so on and so forth. I want to end by highlighting perhaps one particular motif that I think has been deployed in very, very imaginative and creative ways to exemplify, the ways in which this relationship of revision to the oral traditions can really work if handled appropriately by individual filmmakers. And I want to, I'm referring here in particular to the structure as well as some of the motifs of the trickster tale that you find very, very popular among many African societies. And I think this has been one area in which an individual like Sembène Ousmane has really distinguished himself. If you look at his work, Hala, you will see the ways in which Hala not only appropriates some of the structural particularities of the trickster narrative, but more importantly, some of the character motives of the trickster, especially this tendency on the part of the trickster to be a hero at one point, at one moment, and the next moment become a villain. And they try to, Sembène in particular uses this particular resource in the construction of this individual, this character in his film, El Haji, as an allegory, as a way of talking about the experiences of Africans in their fight against colonialism, those who ally themselves with the majority of the people to kick out the colonialists, so to speak, but then turn around and occupy those same positions that they were fighting against the colonialists. And this is something that is very, very much a part and parcel of the motif of the trickster narrative that we find in African societies. But Sembène uses not any particular trickster narrative. The Hala is not, you cannot point to any particular narrative within the society to say, well, Sembène took this narrative to adapt it, to make Hala. What he does is he uses structures and motifs and styles and techniques from the tradition and transmutes those into the requirements of the new medium. And I think this is perhaps the model that he has set that has been reproduced in the work of many, many other African filmmakers. Finally, I want to sort of raise a question regarding the notion of the tradition as the locus of authenticity. That is, the expectation on the part of some people who participate in the critical discourses that in order for a film to be African, that the only way that the Africanness of a film can be gleaned is through the reference, the obligatory reference that that film has to make to the oral traditions, so that those films that do not make any references to the oral traditions are usually pushed aside as, well, not African enough, okay? Which to me is a bit problematic. So I'll just sound that as a question and leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Let me thank Marianne Bonetti and Don Webster, the organizers of the festival, for the invitation, and also Manthia Diawara for his introduction. Actually, I'd like to address briefly the same topic, which was actually a topic that was suggested to us as the position of the filmmaker as a griot. What is particularly interesting in that topic is, first of all, the oxymoronic nature of the formulation. Filmmaking indeed suggests a fairly sophisticated use of technology, while griots in West Africa relate mostly on voice, words, silences, breathing patterns, and sometimes sober music, unless they decided to become involved in the showbiz. Although such a topic in its present formulation, the filmmaker as a griot, could easily feed a debate on tradition and modernity, I rather see it as a manifestation of the institutionalization of a series of metaphors and conventions in the field of African studies. Among others, the metaphor of the African artist as a griot has indeed become a topos in criticism. And the origin of this metaphor is to be found in L'Harmattan, a novel that was published by Sam Ben Ousmane in 1980. And in the preface, Sam Ben writes, and this is a very rough translation, "I don't want to terrorize the African novel. However, I remember that once in what can be called a classical Africa, the griot was the dynamic element of his tribe, clan, village. He was also the obvious witness of all events. He was the one who recorded and exposed in front of everyone and under the palaver tree the facts and deeds of everyone. The notion I have of my work comes from this knowledge, being bound to reality and to the people." So if you look closely at the terminology and the references that Sam Ben uses in this paragraph, we notice, first of all, that some of the terms are very conventional. The palaver tree, for instance, conventional of a certain African mythology. And some of them are clearly obsolete, like the term tribe in French, tribu, which is no longer acceptable because of the connotations that it has. And I'd like to refer you to the works of Jean-Loup Amsel and Mercier on the question of not only the tribe, but the ethnie in French, ethnic in English. So, and maybe more importantly in this paragraph, it's clear that the griot is the weak term of the comparison. In fact, it's more for Sam Ben a pretext to define his own work as a writer and to work out his own tension between a commitment to people as agents of change and his desire to celebrate the essence of African culture. In spite of these difficulties and in spite of a politically dated conception of the role of the African writer, Sam Ben's metaphor has been widely used by critics. Good example is the book by Mildred Mortimer, Journeys to the African French novel. And it's now also, the same metaphor is now applied to filmmakers. It's used, for instance, in the special issue that was published by Research in African Literature in the winter '95. From an epistemological point of view, this can be explained by a more and more obvious kinship between literature and cinema. What is common to the two media is not only the importance of aesthetics in the process of creation, but also it's the fact that a film, just like a book, calls for an active reading. And the Barthes touch a little bit on that in mythology, saying that the image is imperative, but it carries meaning. Therefore, it's a text and must be read. Thus, African writers and African filmmakers have close ties, not only because of the media that they are working with, but even more so that their work manifests the same dynamic and engagement with language and history. And this convergence of aesthetics, language and history might be the best definition of African art today. Now I'd like to apply some of this to the movie that Danny Kouyaté made and that I had the opportunity of seeing the last week, Keita, the Voice of the Griot. Obviously, history and language are pivotal in his movie. The movie is built around the famous epic of Soundiata Keita, the founder of the Mali Empire in the 13th century. The epic tells the story of the son of Nare Magan Diatta, also called sometimes Konate, and the son of Songolo, the Buffalo Woman. Soundiata Keita was born crippled and then recovered the use of his legs, went into exile following the pattern of all the hero of founding texts, and then came back to overthrow the king of the Susu, Soumaoro Kante. In fact, their clash is historically dated, the Battle of Krina in 1235. Of course, this clash reveals the attempt of two groups in the same area to control the trade road to the north of the continent, and of course to control the ownership of the gold mines in the same area. So the Soundiata epic retells, in fact, the foundation of the vast Mali Empire that lasted up to the 15th century and extended at the peak of its development, basically from the Atlantic to Gao on the east, and from the forest in the south to the fringes of the desert. And this empire was so famous that in fact, the king of Mali appears on a Spanish map. He is represented on a Spanish map dated 1375. The oral text of the epic has been recitated by griots throughout centuries, with, of course, several versions. In fact, there are families that are particularly attached to the Keita family, and they are the Kouyatés and the Diabatés. Today, the epic is still recitated, and there is in particular a ceremony every 7 years in the city of Kankaba, kind of contest in which the griots recitate their particular version of the epic. And the versatile and resilient nature of this oral text can probably be explained by its function. Soundiata is in the epic is certainly the cement of the Malinke identity, and this is an idea that is developed by Christopher Miller in his book Theories of the Africans. There are also obviously written versions of the Soundiata's epic, and the most famous ones are those written by Djibril Tamsir, Kamara Lai, Massamakan Diabaté, and others. But to my knowledge, Danny Kouyaté's film is the first cinematographic version of the epic. The film, of course, doesn't represent the whole epic, only the first part, the very beginning. And the existence of this movie is clearly an event. Keita is not only Keita, the voice of the griot, is not only a visual translation of an oral text. It's also a reflection on history as a means of empowerment for the youth in Africa. The film challenges a scattered, evenemential, exogenous notion of history as it is proposed by the curriculum of the schools in Africa today. And the film explores the most appropriate form of history for 21st century Africa. The film suggests that today in urban Africa, young people thirst for knowledge of the past and the genealogies. And we understand that this teaching should be dispensed in the griot's way, the way of the hawk. You may remember this image in the film, whose flight is high in the sky, high and free. Although written in a dichotomic mode, the film is very efficient in its portrayal of the urban bourgeoisie in Africa, a bourgeoisie that is almost representative of what Appiah calls the post-colonial condition, a relatively small Western-style, Western-trained group of people who mediate, says Appiah, the trade in cultural commodities of world capitalism at the periphery. The film is also very effective in its representation of the various modalities of speech delivery. You have the griot speech, the teacher's speech, the mother's speech, and so forth and so on. The structure of the movie is fairly complex in the sense that many narratives are intertwined, sometimes interrupted and then finished later on. In the course of the movie. But more importantly, the movie celebrates the re-establishment of a narrative link between the old man and the young boy, in spite of what is presented as the cultural alienation of the second generation. And you may remember the child telling his friends about his genealogy as soon as he learns about it. So this is clearly a very interesting movie, fascinating at times. I have, however, some concerns. And the first one, Mbye Cham addressed this issue as well. The movie, the constitutive ambivalence of the griot in this movie is more often than not negated by a series of euphemisms. Although we can feel that the presence of the griot in the household as something subversive. But it's just touched upon and not really developed. In the film Keita, the griot has become more of a storyteller than a griot attached to a regal family. And as a result, the epic itself is in a way reduced to a story, to a fairy tale. For instance, when we know, and we know it through the narratives of the Arab travelers, when we know the great ceremonial regalia of the courts, of the African courts in the Middle Ages, it's difficult to believe that Nare Magan was waiting for the hunter just on the tree or just in such simple setting. Also, the very moment when Sundiata rises on a bent pole is actually the moment of the foundation of the Mali Empire. And in the movie, it's presented a little bit like a village scene, and it's, in my opinion, a little bit problematic. The character of the griot in the movie has lost a great deal of its specificities. As you know, the griot deals with evil forces, with the Nyama, and releases those evil forces through action, speech, and the particular energy that he has and cultivated. So he releases at the same time the society of the potentially dangerous forces. Ambiguous also is the support of the griot to political power and families of the nobility. Ambiguous his revelation and manipulation at the same time of the truth. because the griot speech is a very interesting combination of what I would call an indentured yet poetic utterance. The second reason of concern is, but linked to the first one, is the absence in the movie of, if not a radical, at least allusive questioning of a social order that rests on the caste system. And I mean, the caste system, I think Mbye Cham addressed the issue. Social groupings around genealogy and associated with professional capacity that is not the equivalent of the class system. A system that differentiates people socially and prescribe behaviors. So my point was basically that the definition of an African artist as a griot is risky. This is not to say that we shouldn't take the risk, but at least we should know what is at stake behind the use of the concept of the griot when we want to use it to apply to contemporary African production.
Thank you. Wanjiru Kinyanjui.
Yes, I would like to thank the organizers very much for bringing me to New York. This is my first time and I'm really enjoying it. Yes, I must admit that I actually first encountered a griot while I was studying literature and film in Berlin. He was from Senegal, and we became good friends. He's a musician. He teaches African dance and drums and makes the drums and everything. He's called Mamadou Mbaye, and he's from Senegal. He's the one who introduced me to the griot. He said he's from a griot caste and family, and what he's doing in Berlin is a continuation of what he should be doing. And so I asked him to explain, and he did. You know, I wondered how come he's still very traditional in the sense of teaching that the same music, you know, to Germans, to white Germans. There are black Germans too. So that was my introduction to the word griot. I come from Kenya, and according to legend and myth, our first monarchy was disposed of very quickly. So we do not have a history of kings and queens and courts and no courts, and actually we have no griot tradition as such. We probably had a storyteller or somebody, the wise man in the council of elders or whatever, but we do not have this culture, and I have not heard about it in Kenya as such. So the old men were the ones who, old women and old men were the conveyors of knowledge. So having no equivalent, I find that, you know, I'm a filmmaker, I'm a storyteller. I have not, you know, I have never thought of myself as a griot as such, but of course, there are many parallels to any other filmmaker who calls themselves a griot. I will try to tell you a bit of my background, or the background in Kenya, the social background. The British, who are our colonial masters, tried, well, maybe they didn't try too much, but the missionaries tried a bit more to actually get rid of African culture and say it's evil and it should be done away with. So when I was going to school, we were not allowed to speak Kikuyu, Kiswahili, Luo, Kamba. We have about 40 languages in Kenya. In schools, we were not allowed to speak them because we were supposed to learn English properly. So if you were caught speaking any other language, you were punished, mainly by sitting kuku. Kuku is chicken, so you had to put your hands through your legs and hold your ears until you start crying, you know, like you stand there outside the staff room and really get tortured. So to go with that language problem, there was also the cultural problem. When I was doing music in high school, there was classical Western music until something like 1973, when an African professor actually managed to make 50% of the music exam, O-level and A-level, African music. Same applies to art. When I was in art class, we used to do portraits, but we do portraits more of our Indian or English teacher. I didn't know how to mix the paint for a black face. I couldn't get the right color because I never learned that. And that was not... So actually, basically what we were doing, in cookery, yes, we had ovens and we were learning how to make English custard and, the way you eat more in London than in Kenya. So basically what was happening there is a very, I call it a cultural vacuum because you were not taught anything that was before your time. It was taboo even to talk about the independence war. The Mau Maus were supposed to be terrorists and cannibals. They used to sacrifice their children, etc., etc. There's a very informative book by Robert Truer called Uhuru, and this book has that sort of very propagandistic British point of view on the Mau Maus, which was prevalent then. So actually, till it is only in the 90s, I think, that these subjects are coming up again and being discussed freely and openly. It was taboo to do that. So what I'm trying to come to is to say that any oral literature, any stories, even about animals and about, there are very many, anything about my past, myths, legends, I don't know where I got it. It must have been my grandmother or my grandfather or some old person, who, by the way, tells you these things. And I found myself actually thinking about it a lot. And because we were taught to not desire anything in your past, Africanness was bad. When the music exam, for example, was introduced, I thought it was okay, but half of us thought it wasn't okay. I mean, that music is primitive, and that is how far we had gone. And the music teacher for this exam had to teach a young boy from another school, very English school, because there were there was apartheid actually in Kenya. There were European schools and there were Indian schools. There was a second class and third class was African schools. So whoever went to a European school much later, when the Africans were admitted after independence, would not learn anything African, of course. And their English has a very English tinge to it. So this young boy had music exam half African, and he didn't have a teacher, of course. So my teacher was teaching him at the conservatoire. It's British Kenyan Cultural Center, but it's actually British Cultural Center. So she was kicked out of the conservatory. She got a letter and was asked to please stop teaching that. They were renting a room there. Please stop teaching this primitive music or get out. So she got out and they tried to find another place because. So from what I'm trying to say is that anything that I have learned from my past or my culture is sort of learned by the way. It wasn't taught. It wasn't emphasized by anybody. And since we don't even have a griot tradition as such, there's nobody trying to preserve these things or to pass them on, unless you hear them by accident. So when I went to Germany, I got a lot of African culture. I was shocked that there's so much and they're so rich. And they have museums with African art. And they have concerts with the best African musicians. And I was just delighted. And then they have everything from the diaspora. I mean. Miles Davis was playing every now and then in the best concert halls. You could see Miles Davis, you could see Peter Tosh, you could see Bob Marley, you could see Miriam Makeba, and Youssou N'Dour, everybody. And so I was sort of African films too. So I was immersed. I immersed myself actually for the first time in African culture. And so when I started making films, actually one of my first films was about this griot's work in Berlin. So I was doing a camera seminar, and I photographed him doing his griot work. And now he does my music up to now. Like, he did the music for the film which was here. But he's actually the one who got me thinking. And this discussion, I could maybe talk a bit about my film, because I have sort of done the same thing as other African filmmakers have done, but not consciously thinking I should be trying to preserve, or I should be trying to, or I'm a griot, or I should make an African film. But out of interest and out of maybe passion or whatever, I'm interested in my past, and I'm interested in passing it on, and I'm interested in actually researching it, because I think my film was more of research than actual saying this is what it is. I did the film The Battle of the Sacred Tree, and it was a Ugandan story. There's a sacred tree there too. Mamadou Mbye told me about the baobab and the griot, and so I figured this is an interesting topic. I mean, So the tree, I did not know what this tree looked like. Nobody had ever shown it to me. So I set about looking for a tree, a sacred tree. I knew we had one. I knew the myths and legends, but they were just, they were in my head. So I went out to the countryside and started looking for the sacred tree. I found it where I was born, but I didn't know that before. So when I got it, I asked people about it. They told me stories. And I thought, I have to incorporate some of these stories in my film. I wish I had, if I do a documentary, I'd have to do a documentary actually on these stories they told me, because I can't put everything in my film, because actually that was not the subject. So anyhow, I discovered a lot of things about this tree, about the relationship between people and the tree up to now, which is still true, but which is hidden because there's no worship under the tree anymore. And there's no, actually people pass it and they don't think twice about it. But what was interesting was the ambivalence of the relationship between the oral tradition and the sort of also psychological power of this tree, that nobody will touch it, but nobody knows why. Nobody knows really why, the history. But I was told that very many things can happen if you strike it, and they do happen. They do happen. Like somebody cut it down and built a bar, and he died within a year. I mean, it's still called Mugumo Bar. It's in my hometown, and etc. Such things. So actually, what I was doing is reviving something. Taking something out of history, out of myth, out of legend, and translating it into film, or integrating it into what I had for a story. So I was finding out things and trying to put them in my story. And in fact, I have an old man who is telling the children this story of the tree, or some Kikuyu myths and legends. But I don't know if, I'd call myself a griot, because we don't have that tradition. I'd say it's out of, in my culture, actually, it's more that if you excel in anything, or if you're more interested in something, you are made the natural leader, you are made the natural soloist. If everybody appreciates your voice, people choose you. People say, she has to sing, or he has to lead the singing, or he has to lead the building, he's good at that, etc. So it was a sort of more natural succession of whatever. The only thing maybe was the medical thing, because that one includes a lot of training, but that had nothing to do with griot, it was medicine. Yes, maybe I'll talk a little bit about Kenyan filmmaking. There's hardly any, and popular culture and filmmaking is also probably very new subject for Kenya, because we are used to people coming from Hollywood, from Germany, from everywhere, and using Kenya. Kenya is very beautiful. You can get any kind of geography, altitude, vegetation. You can choose actually your landscape, from desert to the Alps, and forest and everything. So we are more used to servicing the north when they come to shoot in the city or in the Masai Mara Game Reserve, the animals. And so popular culture, which, as I said, has been suppressed for a very long time because the present government and the former government have done the same thing as the British were doing, not really promoting any art, any culture, even encouragement. I didn't get any from the Kenyan government. And I didn't get any interested parties telling me, Wanjiru, come here, we know you're a poor filmmaker and we'll give you our office and you can use the phone. There's nothing like that. So they're very surprised actually to have a film all of a sudden. They didn't know, they don't know what that is. But they're quite surprised to have a film. And so culture in Kenya is something that, you talk about culture and people look at you and what do you mean? You want to make a film? So why don't you take the subject of street children? That will sell. Or you get money for it. You will get sponsors. That is our level of culture, and it's very sad. And of course, as a filmmaker, I think that we have to make more films on popular culture so that we can get back also to culture. Because people are really used to seeing Hollywood and they think film is dollars. Film is, if you don't make something with Masais, it's not a film. If you don't adapt a play by Samuel Beckett or by Edward Albee, it's not a play. If you adopt Ngugi wa Thiong'o and put him in the theater, in the same theater, people will think, no, you can't be serious. If you want to get like Malian griot music to a concert hall in Kenya, you'll have a lot of trouble. But get used to do that's okay. That's more. He's more accepted West. It's not so traditional. It's not so African. And so we have a lot of work to do to actually convince people our culture is worth it, our culture is okay, and you try to get down to it. I think that I will stop there. And
thank you. Camera.
Okay, I also want to thank everyone who was responsible for putting this event together, this panel and the festival, Mahen and Don and Manthia as well, and also the other panelists, because I feel like I've learned a lot just this afternoon. I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction. In thinking about popular culture and African film, I began at first to think about the idea of the city in African film, which is something that I'm especially interested in. And this is something that Manthia has done some work on as well, the idea of urban space as a kind of contested space in the way that urban space is constructed in African film. And so I was interested in films like Jean-Pierre Bekelo's Quartier Mozart and Mirzak Alwash's Babeloued City, and also Drissa Toure's film Haramuya, which are very much about very specific spaces, even spaces within the city and subcultures within the urban culture. So that was what I was going to do, and then I saw Girl 6, and I sort of had to change everything for two reasons. I thought two things, first of all. First of all, I thought, well, finally we have our own Pretty Woman, for what that's worth. But also I thought I could never imagine a film like this being produced anywhere in Africa, and why not? One of the significant differences and the sort of ongoing and long-standing differences, I think, between African-American film and African cinema is sex. The visual iconography of African-Americans has been forever a highly sexualized iconography, and that's been largely done and accomplished through cinema. From The Birth of a Nation to Josephine Baker's films to Girl 6. There's a of a huge kind of landscape of representation of black people in the West that is about their existence as sexual beings. And it's a very different context, I think, when we begin to talk about African subjects, continental African subjects. For instance, there is a huge and prolific black and interracial pornography industry in the U.S. That doesn't have a corollary anywhere else. African filmmakers themselves often deal with and treat sexuality and sex in a way that one doesn't ever find, and one probably will never find among African filmmakers. I think of the beginning of Melvin Van Peebles' film Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. I think of Girl 6. And there's just something that is very much different there. There appears to be a kind of a silence or a gap in what one might call the kind of provisionary canon of African cinema around sex and around representation of sexuality, and that for me is sort of an interesting question to explore. For me, the silence was broken very recently, a couple of weeks ago, when Harry Allen showed up on an African cinema conference on the internet and asked a question, quite bold, straight up. He said, "Does anybody know of any African erotic films?" And African erotic films. I thought, well, that's, I would never even have thought to ask that question, because it just, it seemed to me clear that that was a kind of a contradiction in terms, that it's just not a concern from what I know of African filmmakers. But then I began to think about it more, and it's not as if, Harry Allen is someone who is unaware of the kind of context of cultural production in Africa. So the question, I think, began to be about not so much, where can I find some African erotic films, as it was, what is the nature of this gap? What is the nature of this silence? Two things happened on that conference. One was, first of all, no one knew of a single African erotic film, and this is, from the assembled wisdom of dozens of scholars and experts and fans of African film, but also the discussion broadened from, whether or not there were African erotic films, which is in the end not such an important question, but it broadened to the question of the erotic in African films, which for me is much more interesting. Zainabu Irene Davis came up with Jibril Diop Membetti's Tuki Buki and Desiree Ekare's Faces of Women. Mark Reed came on with Farid Bougadir's Halfouine, which he feels is one of the most sensual films he's ever seen. And there are a bunch of others one could add. Cartier Mozart, actually, is very much about sex and a kind of a satire around sexuality. Bab El Oued City, for me, has an incredibly erotic scene when the woman, the sort of sister who is being oppressed by her Islamic fundamentalist brother, Yamina, and she's forced to wear the veil. The scene where she unveils herself in a public place to her lover is just an incredibly charged scene. Charged because there is the constant threat of violence in it, but also because it's a very kind of sensual scene in the way that the characters interact. I think of Flora Gomez's film, The Blue Eyes of Yanta, and for some reason, there's this one image in particular that sticks with me from that film where Yanta is wearing this big belt which has a huge watch in the center. It looks like something that Flavor Flav used to wear. And it's this kind of fetish for me because it's this, first of all, it's a bizarre thing that draws attention to itself whenever she is on screen. But also it's the sort of the way it's placed on her body and the way she kind of uses and the way the other characters respond to it just makes me think that there's this kind of sexual standing in for something else in that particular object. So the discussion in this group began to be about all the ways that African films may not explicitly show sexuality, but do deal very much with pleasure offered, pleasure deferred, pleasure delayed, those sorts of things. And from all of that, certain things began to sort of come up. First of all, that African filmmakers are not likely to make films for the purpose of getting people off. That is simply not an issue in a context where there are just so many other important things to make films about, to leave it at its simplest level. But also that sexual representation in African cinema, where it has been present, has followed a sort of set of unwritten codes that kind of describe the range and the presence, I think, of possible erotic elements. There are, of course, differences in different parts of Africa in different sort of filmmaking contexts. Obviously, filmmakers in Islamic countries have a very different set of circumstances to work with around representation than filmmakers in more secular countries. There are other sort of factors, I think, that account for the kind of gap that I spoke about in terms of sexual representation. First among them, I think, would be the conditions of production. The financing for most African films comes from a combination of government sources. Government sources always have strings attached, and whether you're talking about African governments or European governments, usually in this case the French government, there is a kind of a prescription that goes along with the check. With the French government in particular, I would say that there is often a kind of a caretaking aspect to what subjects are deemed suitable for films. And many African filmmakers have complained about the sort of patronizing nature of the funding of their films. It's almost in a way, in talking about it in this context, it's almost in a way that the African artists are treated as children, and children don't have sex, so sex is inappropriate for an African film. There's also, I think, among filmmakers, obviously, among many African filmmakers, a pedagogical imperative, where, as I say, there are simply more important things to make films about, but also that the films themselves, because they are expensive to make in a context where expense is a political issue, and because it takes so much effort and time and energy to get an African filmmaker to the point where he or she is able to actually get a film produced, there is a kind of a duty or a responsibility that goes along with taking up that position as a filmmaker. Whether one talks about oneself as a filmmaker, as a griot or not, there is, I think, usually among African filmmakers a sense of responsibility, what I call in the context of Black Canadian filmmaking, actually, where it also exists, a cinema of duty. There is also, of course, the very important question of Western contamination, sexual representation on screen, and especially the sexual representation of Black faces and Black bodies and Black subjects, having been so thoroughly colonized already. By a long history of racist narrative films, by obviously pornography, also I think by ethnography, which turns sexual behavior into a kind of an object of scientific curiosity. And this, I think, is related to that sort of infantilizing aspect that I talked about earlier in terms of how the films are funded and what that means. So these, I think, are some of the factors that account for that gap. And yet, there is, as I said, sexuality. In fact, one of the participants in this conference on the net said that when she teaches Yelen to her students in South Africa, one of them in particular commented that there was too much pornography in it. And that was, to me, a very surprising thing. And she made the very, I think, important point that obviously sexuality and clearly pornography is in the eye of the beholder. And in the case of this one student, that film, which many other viewers would think is not at all sexually explicit, was deemed pornographic. There is, I think, also the influence, and this is something that may in fact increase, that the sort of art film, in particular the French art film, has had on the representation of gender and the representation of sex in certain African films, for both, to both good and bad ends, I think. Jean-Marie Thénault's new film, Clando, has some very kind of tender, intimate love scenes that have sort of a psychological presence and a character motivation, and also a sort of épaté les bourgeois sort of sensibility within them that I think is very much influenced by a sort of history of European art cinema. There are also a certain number of sexual types in African film that do exist, even where there isn't explicit sexual representation. I would say the female victim is chief among them. There are many, many films about the oppression of women, usually made by male filmmakers, actually, interestingly enough. And there is almost a kind of a subgenre recently of films, documentaries and fiction films about female genital mutilation. And those kinds of films in particular, I think, can kind of stand in as the exemplar of the sort of African woman as victim, as sexual victim film. There's a furor right now that's happening over a film that's about to come out by Ingrid Sinclair in Zimbabwe called Flame, which is about the history of the liberation movement and the war in Zimbabwe from the point of view of the women soldiers, and including scenes of rape of the women soldiers by their fellow male liberation fighters, not by the other side. And there's been a furor over this because Ingrid Sinclair, and the film generally is calling into question the history of that liberation war, where to ascribe blame, the kind of political dynamics of rape. Lots of very, very difficult questions for a society that has only recently, that is still, I think, coming to grips with what that war meant. One of the other sexual types that one sees in a lot of African films is the cuckold or the impotent man. In Hala, one sees that, and in a number of other African films. Obviously, that type and that tradition, that narrative, didn't spring from film, but has a long history in the oral tradition as well. And another interesting point, I think, in Hala and in other films is that sex in African cinema tends very often to be linked to comedy, which I think indicates both a kind of an honest acceptance of how funny sex can be, but also a kind of movement away from a more serious sort of erotic dimension in sexuality. So all of these are just sort of points for discussion. These are just sort of things that I'm bringing up as a way of hoping to open a debate about the subject. In terms of what's happening now, I would say there is a sort of gradual opening up of sexual subjects and sexual representation in what you could call the mainstream of African cinema in sort of Francophone West Africa. In the Maghreb countries, obviously Islamic law is shutting down the range of representation. As you may know, if you have a married couple in a film produced in a country that's ruled by Islamic law, unless the actors themselves are married, one cannot show them touching on screen. And so that, of course, limits the range of possibilities. So at the same time as we have Islamic law influencing representation, as we have a sort of gradual opening up in the Francophone West African countries, we also have things like Jan Kerkhoff, who is an expatriate South African based in Amsterdam, who made a film which was at FESPACO last year in Burkina Faso called Confessions of a Yeovil Rapist. And Yeovil is kind of like the Soho of Johannesburg, sort of a trendy neighborhood. And it's a very brutal film that deals with a sort of outburst of incredibly brutal violence in a seemingly calm and placid and very trendy neighborhood in Johannesburg. And what Kerkhoff is dealing with, the film doesn't entirely work, and his films often don't entirely work, but what I think he's dealing with that is very important is a sort of notion of sexual psychosis as a product of apartheid. And that's something that I don't know of anyone else that's dealt with that. The film was, I think, received very badly at FESPACO, partly because there was no precedent for it, and there was no, in a way, there was no warning. No one knew what this film was about. It was screened to an audience that included local Burkinabe and the usual sort of critics and people who attend the festival from abroad. And there was just a furor in the theater because, I think there was just no way of laying the groundwork for a film like this in that particular context unless, you have a number of films like that have played before. And there really, I don't think, had been a film that had played like that film at FESPACO before. One last I think, possibility for the future. There's a short film by the Burkinabe filmmaker Fanta Nakro called Pouk Nini, which deals with sexual desire and sexual infidelity, but from the perspective of an African woman. And this is something that is also new. It's rare, I think, and one gets in the short film. It's a story of a man who essentially becomes bewitched by another woman, not his wife. And what happens as a result, and part of what happens as a result is that the two women, the man's wife and his lover, actually come to terms with one another at the man's expense. And it's an interesting story. There's a real sort of complexity and a range of tones, and some contradictions also within the film that I think is unusual for this kind of story. And as I said, it ends with this sort of allegiance between the two women. So, I think there are a number of different things happening now, which includes more women making films about sexuality, includes things like Jan Kirchhoff's work, which I think is disturbing but important. But then on the other hand, you have things like the influence of Islamic law. So, at this point, it's impossible to say what will happen. I don't think that there will be a kind of sexual revolution in African film, nor do I think there is a need for that. But one does find people sort of moving off in different and very interesting directions.
Well, I'd like to, we should thank the panel for collective and stimulating presentation, and then we're going to have some questions, but I'd like to thank them first. It's opened up for questions or comments directed collectively to the panel or to individuals as you wish. If you, yes.
Point of information, what is the address of the discussion?
Oh, I don't have it with me, but if you give me your email address, I can email it to you.
If I can just make a just a short comment in relation to what Cameron was saying, which I thought was very interesting, the issue of sexuality, especially in relation to Faces of Women, which when it showed in Waga, was roundly, according to the, what's sondage, the poll that was made.
Took a poll in Waga.
Yeah, they took a poll in Waga to sound out people's response to the film. And to a person, it was sort of put down because they say, oh, this is not African. I mean, it's too sexually explicit. Africans don't do this and do that. So, I mean, on that basis alone, on the basis of this explicit sexuality, which took about maybe 10 minutes of the screen time, the film was shut down. But, I mean, if you look at the overall structure of the film, it couldn't be more African because it is one that is very much grounded in storytelling, narrative techniques, and something I thought was very, very interesting and kind of an addition to the stuff that you were saying. Ian's film, I find a little bit problematic. I think he has changed the title to "Nice to Meet You, Please Don't Rape Me." I don't know why he chose from Confessions of a Yeovil Rapist to "Nice to Meet You, Please Don't Rape Me." But I don't know. I just find it a little bit disturbing, in the sense that in the post-apartheid, in the immediate post-apartheid era in South Africa, there seems to be the emergence of a number of films from the white Afrikaner community there that is really attempting to perhaps laugh apartheid away in very, very disturbing ways. We saw just about 2 or 3 weeks ago in Milan this film called Soweto Green, which I don't know how many of you have seen it, but is quite insulting as far as I'm concerned to African Americans in particular, and Africans in general, and people who participated in that whole struggle there. And there's also the other film, Taxi to Soweto, which all come out of that a mold that tries to say that, well, the situation in South Africa is really not simply black-white. It's really more complex. And what is the way that they try to insert this notion of complexity into the situation in South Africa is by really constructing these narratives that I think, to a large extent, at the expense of the majority of the blacks, who actually bore the brunt of the struggle during the apartheid era. I mean, even though I thought that the very idea of sexuality that Ian was trying to introduce into the discourse was one that's quite necessary, but I'm just not sure the way.
I mean, I have to say I didn't see his film as in a way similar to Taxi to Soweto or Soweto Green, because those films are, farces, very low comedies to me. This film, I watched it as almost a horror movie because it just has some incredibly brutal scenes in it. Even when there's nothing brutal going on screen, there's a brutal sensibility at work in the film. And so to me, it was a sort of a horror movie that came out of horrific circumstances. And so I would probably take that film a little more seriously as a sort of an expression of apartheid than I would, these comedies.
Questions? Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Have you seen the film The
Yes. For me, in terms of this context, and actually just generally, it's a really important film. I think it's extraordinarily well made, but also very important in terms of the subjects it addresses and the way that it addresses them. What's interesting is that the sexuality in that film, and it is a very sort of sensual film, and it's a film about sort of a sexual power relationship that is long-standing and probably unchanging in that particular household in terms of how the men use the servant women. But what's interesting is that the sexuality is so cloistered. It sort of represents or sort of mirrors the actual dynamic that existed in the household. Given that, though, I think that Mufida Tlatley is sort of able to keep the story focused on the perspective of the mother and the daughter, the two women, and I think that's the hardest thing to do when their sort of roles within the home are so passive. Essentially, they're sort of meant to sort of serve and be receptors, and she's able to sort of still turn that into something that's an interesting perspective filmically. So yeah, I mean, I think this is that kind of approach to representing the situation where you have both the sensuality, but you also have the sort of political dynamic of the relationship between the men and the women, the servants and the masters, I think is important. And I would love to see more films that sort of were as complex as that.
If I could just follow up on that question. Some of the issues that you raised, and I don't know what the context of production of the film. Perhaps you do, and my comments on if it has implications for production and reproduction.
The conditions
of production of the film.
of this particular film? I really don't know the details. I assume that like most Tunisian films, it was made with a significant amount of money from various French ministries with some...
Attia is the producer, Ahmed Attia.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't want to dwell on the sexuality.
Nor do I.
It's a very interesting topic. Like, when I read the works of Mbye Cham, they state that this might be an incorrect quote, that Africans are notoriously religious. And then when you look at that and analyze that, you can say, well, if religion exists in a culture, to the extent it becomes overbearing or notoriously, then Africans are notoriously political. And it's very interesting when you see a lot of African sisters or sisters on content or making films that are geared more towards sexuality. Maybe it's very good to investigate that.
Go ahead. I just don't want to overstate the case. I wouldn't say that African women filmmakers are making films, sort of films about sexuality. I think that their perspective is bringing sort of a different take on sexuality, but that's not necessarily or even very often the focus of the films.
Yes, as a filmmaker, I'd like to comment on the sexual aspect, like in film and in life, also like in relationships with other people and with, like lovers and whatever. I think if you walk through Nairobi city, you will not see a single couple kissing in the street. You will not see couples holding hands, not if they are native. You see white couples and black American and holding hands or kissing in the street. But you don't see African couples doing that. You never see these things. And so when you're writing or when you're directing a scene, a love scene on screen, it's what you're seeing. And you're trying to represent a society which does that. It would be very hard for me to not edit those very explicit scenes, sexual scenes. Implication, imply. Try to find a way of saying the same thing, but say it around. But you don't have to show the actual sexual act or sexual whatever. When I was making my last film, my French cameraman kept saying, "But now they are so close, you should make them kiss." There's an affair going on all the time. No, Wanjiru, no. They say, no, they're not going to kiss in my film. So every time he thought this is the right scene, this is close, this is really good. And I said no. And I didn't say no conscious. Of course I said no consciously. But because I was representing something, I was trying to reflect something that goes on and, not a rebel couple who do things anytime, anywhere. Because that will be too much. If an old man passes by, you feel really embarrassed if they catch you kissing. So you hide somewhere and kiss. This is our society. And so, of course, because film is visual, it's not like you're talking to a friend in your private room. Film is, some old people are going to come, your mother is going to come and whatever. It's like you're exposing somebody. I mean, the actresses don't want it. The actors don't want it. So you have a whole social structure there, and a whole lot of, if you're working with actors and they don't want it, you can't force them. You can fire them and try to get somebody, but I don't know.
If you please, one more statement on the erratic so we can talk about popular on the African cinema. What is popular in popular African cinema?
Is that because of Islamic influence or Islamic politics?
No. That is just the structure of African families, of African society. You respect your elders, so you don't show him things they don't need to know. That is your private thing. You don't need to wash your dirty linen in public or to show that you do this and that. Nobody is interested. I mean, for me, nobody is interested. Yes.
There may be a we don't need to go into this. We can that's fine. So the violence is suggested, just like in Greek tragedy, the violence have a cost. And I think that if we focus only on sexuality, we may be over Freudianizing something in cinema. And maybe that what we're talking about is the epistemology of storytelling, the way people approach telling stories, direction or indirection. Whereas But we know that in American society, explicitness sells. It's commercialized explicitly. I mean, I don't think we should look upon African cinema as moving into an advanced stage because it's moving closer to a girly, take it off.
I hope I wasn't saying that.
Well, wait.
Also, that violence, technical thing, let us have bodies moving on the face and spraying and blood on them.
Okay. As the moderator, I want to speak. I think this is a very important issue which has to be discussed, however, in the technological apparatus of cinema, as Wanjiru was trying to suggest. Now, if you take West Africa, and I really liked one factor today that came out of the panel, our different notions of Africa. We West Africans start talking about the griot as if the griot is all of Africa. And then Wanjiru came and said, well, I learned about the griot in Germany. I didn't know what the griot was until I went to Germany. So that tells you a lot about Africa. And then the new South Africa is also coming up with these films. And I don't know anything about these films. So it tells us something very important about Africa as regional imaginary, but also about Africa that those of us who work in the West want to define. We have our Africa, and Africans have their Africa. Different places of Africa have their Africa. I'm not saying that these Africas are more false or truer than the other. I'm not saying that. But it's very important to keep this in mind. Now, if we go back to what is popular in African cinema, when we say popular African cinema, what is popular? I think that Cameron is quite right that sexuality is one of the popular elements in any culture, African anywhere. But how do you make it popular? For us, for example, in West Africa, the most popular film, erotic film is The Money Order. It's the most incredible erotic film. But this eroticism just doesn't get read on cinema. Why? Because, well, first of all, because of Sambène Ousmane himself. Sambène Ousmane himself chose a film language that is very Western. That is so Western that when he does the African things, you really have to read into them sometimes. It's Western in the sense that it borrowed a dialectics, the oppressed and the oppressor type of dialectics. A Marxist dialectics that is teleological, beginning, middle, and end. Now, when you do that, as Wanjiru was saying, this Western language takes base by oppressing African language, African aesthetics, everything else. Now, in The Money Order, for example, when the guy ate in the beginning of the film, I don't know if you remember this, bald head, he eats a lot, he overeats, he starts burping, he sleeps, takes a nap, he's going out to pray. Muslim man, you gotta go to pray. He sees a woman coming out dressed in a very special manner that West Africans know as very seductive, as very sexy. He just forgets about Allah and goes back in the room with the woman. It's one of the most incredible scenes, but people don't pay attention to it. It cannot be read because Sambène already had them positioned to read this teleological dialectic in African cinema. Now, what is really important to me, or interesting to me, when we come to the popular in African cinema, is that the new films, at the risk of not being cinema, have introduced the popular by positioning the African spectators. That is telling, and the griot is really important, as Mbye and Sylvie have tried to show that. You cannot create the popular in West Africa without going through the griot, first of all. But now, when you go through the griot, what is popular still in African cinema? And I think Gimba, Keita, Haramuya, Jelly tried to show us that. And they show it to us at their own expense. Because when you do this, Cannes Film Festival reviewers are not gonna like your film. New York Times reviewers are not gonna like your film because you are going away from the classical film language and you're trying to redefine cinema. I mean, for those of us who are in cinema, this is really crucial. How do you do this? How do you bring in what is popular in your culture in front of the camera without editing it for the Western spectator? You know, this is beyond anything Afrocentric or Eurocentric. This is a fact. How do you do that? And that's really because when you make a film, you have to speak to somebody. You have to edit for somebody. And I think what is daring about Gimba, Haramuya, Keita, if it's not daring on the language level, by the way, it's daring on the ideology level. That's the problem that Sylvie had with Keita, for example. So what is daring about them is that they suddenly begin to digress and say, oh, Salif Keita knows what is popular in African music. Isunduru knows what is popular in African music. So I'm going to look for what is popular in African cinema. And I think Cameron is right. Sexuality is one of those, but it's not the only one. For example, for me, what is other elements of popular would be the image of the hunter, for example. This hunter, it's become the biggest unconscious of this kind of African cinema. You remember Yele when, this is again an inside story, that's not cinema, but that is very West African. One character died in the film while they were making it. And then Suleiman Sise wanted to pay tribute to this character. And then the sun is setting, and then the guy walks toward the sun, and then there is a mundane song. So his lifespan is compared to the sun. But he's very big. He's in all of Solo's films. I don't know if you have seen Finye, Bara, he's in all of them. He's a very big guy, and he had the hunter shirt. It's kind of brown with mirrors and strings hanging. You've seen that kind of dashiki in many African films. So he's walking toward the sun, and the song is sung. Now you see the same two hunters in Kramo Fadiga's Jelly. You see them in Keita. You see them it's become the unconscious of West African cinema because it comes from Sunjata epic. And when you put that on the screen, anybody in West Africa, Ivory Coast, Burkina, Mali, Senegal, they know this image right away. There is that. What is popular in African cinema? This is really what, in the world popular African culture, what is popular? The griot is popular, the hunter is popular, sexuality is going to be popular. You can't go away from it. Music is popular. So I think we should try to, on the one hand, I think we're quite right to focus on sexuality, but this has been a very good panel, so we should really look for other elements of popular. And having said this, if you still want to say something about sexuality, go right ahead and say it.
Despite all.
Yes.
Yeah. First of all, I just wanted to say that I saw Soweto Green in a packed house in Harare, Zimbabwe, and people were roaring the entire time. And so, just to let you know, that kind of response there. I guess what I find interesting about sexual relationships, people commit suicide, so there is violence, and there's all of that in there. So I'm just wondering how drama and storytelling, which is often very violent, very sexual, hasn't translated onto the screen. Maybe the panelists can speak to that.
Who wants to address that? Yeah.
Yes. Like I have a scene, what I'm writing now, a woman gives birth. There is a sexual act. And I'm asking myself, it's in the film. It's going to be in the film, but how am I going to do it? It's not, the problem is not I don't want to put it in, and I'm going to put it in. But the thing is, I have to find my own way of doing it in the way agreeable to myself, so that when I watch the film, I can stand up to it and say, this is my, my thing. So it is not a matter of whether you show explicitly the sexual act, but whether it's in the film. see it like it's a matter of packaging it. How you package it, it's there. So it's not, I don't know if you can do that also in theater, because in theater a lot of things are done in dialogue anyway. You know, I mean, theater is more, it's not so visual as film. So in film you have to translate some things, and then the method is what matters, so that your language is the same. I mean, so your language is true to your, whatever you want to do.
Wanjiru, how much of that decision is influenced by your sense of your audience, of who's going to be watching the film and how they're going to be watching it? Does that come into it at all, or no?
I don't think so. It's just my decision whether I can live with it or not, whether I made this picture or not, because it's whether I can stand up to it and respect my own whatever. I think it's more of a sense of what you call, you know, if you learned to eat with a fork and spoon, fork and knife, and you suddenly have to eat with the fingers because you have nothing, you feel it's different, you know. It's not what you know. So I think it's just a matter of what one has in their system, in their background, culture, what is correct, what is improper, what is proper, what is acceptable, even to oneself.
Two last questions. Oui.
Moi, je voudrais peut-être parler directement français. Ce qui me paraît important, c'est, disons, la relation du cinéaste avec le rôle qu'il assigne à son film.
They say what is important to him. This is Kramoko Lansine. He is a filmmaker from Ivory Coast. They say what the filmmaker must do first of all is to create his own relation to his film.
Disons, l'objectif que le cinéaste se fixe est d'abord d'atteindre. C'est ça qui me paraît le plus important et qui détermine en fait tout ce qu'on peut montrer dans le film.
What is the goal that the filmmaker sets for him or herself to achieve, first of all, in the film?
Et c'est pourquoi, d'abord, il y a une petite erreur qu'on fait, parce que quand on parle de film africain d'une manière générale,
so there is a mistake already when you talk about African cinema in this general sense.
Parce que l'Afrique est un continent, ce n'est pas un pays.
So it's a continent, it's not a country.
C'est un pays avec différentes cultures.
So it's countries with different cultures.
Différentes spécificités culturelles.
And different cultural specificities.
Et différentes spécificités religieuses, en fait.
And
religieuses aussi.
Attitude and religious specificities as well.
C'est pourquoi ça me paraît une aberration de dire que le cinéma africain, par exemple, a telle ou telle relation avec le sexe.
So it's kind of not aberrant to say that African cinema has this or that relation, to use a global African cinema as having this or that relation to sex.
Moi, un film comme moi, par exemple, quand je tourne une scène, je tiens compte de ma culture, je tiens compte de ceux qui vont voir le film avant de prendre une attitude.
So when I make a film and I'm filming a scene, I take into account my own culture and the people who are going to see the film when I make it.
Et étant donné que le film que je veux le montrer à tous les publics.
And since I want to show my film to a larger public and all the publics. Yeah.
Donc, mon attitude vis-à-vis de la scène à montrer par exemple dans le sexe se sent tout de suite dans...
So there is a relation and an inter-influence in the way I'm going to make this scene. There is an automatic relation that's shaped by the public that I'm trying to reach.
Pour revenir en fait au thème de ce panel, qui est l'image populaire.
So to come to the theme, the main theme of this panel, which has to do with African popular culture.
La seule chose que je veux noter, c'est qu'en fait, il faudrait noter la volonté du cinéaste africain de témoigner.
So the only thing, the main thing I want to emphasize here is the willingness of the African filmmaker to become a witness for his culture.
De témoigner ce qu'il vit.
To witness may not be the best translation, but to be able to represent something that he lives.
Que ce soit par exemple dans la culture de l'Ouest, qui est ma culture, à travers l'attitude du griot.
So whether it is the West African culture, which is his culture, which is shown through the griot,
Ou à travers par exemple le film de Wanjiru que j'ai vu.
Or through the culture as seen in the film of Wanjiru.
Qui n'a pas de tradition de griot, mais qui a même cette même attitude, cette même volonté de témoigner et de montrer.
So where you don't have griots, but there is the same willingness, the same desire to represent, to show cultures.
Donc je pense que c'est ça qu'il faut essayer de voir plutôt.
So this is really what we should be looking for in some ways.
Essayer de montrer notre culture, de faire comprendre certaines choses, et que, ma foi, quand vous avez vu un film africain, il vous reste quelque chose, que vous ayez l'impression d'avoir pris contact avec une certaine réalité à un certain moment.
To show the cultures so that when you see an African film, there is something that you take with you, which stays with you as the representation of the culture of the filmmaker. So there is another panel coming, so he's not going to dwell too long on it. Yeah. One last question. Okay, yeah.
I guess it's for like any of the panelists. I thought Sylvie kind of locating Rio with Simbin, kind of bridge of both literature and film is really interesting, and in particular because Simbin being a novelist, and most of the films we're talking about in African cinema are features. And I was just wondering, which in some ways validate both of those genres, both feature production as the cinema and that's literature. I wonder if anyone's seen any other impulses in African film media making which sidestep both feature production as an end goal or script or literature as something that's going to be regurgitated onto the screen.
So we have Sylvie and then Mbye address this question.
No, I'm not sure.
She's not sure she understands.
Okay, you want to address it first?
I'm not sure either. If I,
let me just say one thing. In terms of like African American production, there is always this tension between. You look at kind of like 70s pre-Spike Lee. There was this desire possibly to make it into the cinema houses, but it wasn't really until he actually did it. It wasn't really there, which is pretty much like. And so you have people who that is their end goal, both financially, in terms of fame, in terms of like doing long storytelling through that medium, but also there's just a wealth of work which does not have that as a goal at all. Talk about it as media art or experimental film or whatever. So I'm just wondering if there's any other correlation like that.
Yeah. Well, from my conversations with African filmmakers, I think all of them have this desire to have their films circulate as widely as possible and to access, the widest possible distribution networks. But it's just that the way that the system is set up, the way the industry works, there are certain, I guess, requirements that one has to submit to in order to be able to make it into those circuits there, which a lot of them, have not really either not been able to or not just outright willing to submit to in order to get that. But I think there's that basic desire there to have their films shown as widely and seen as by as many people as possible.
Cameron?
Yeah, I don't know of any experimental work for the most part, but I would say that maybe the two forms that do stand outside of the sort of feature film economy are animation, and there are some African film animators. Celia Sawadogo is one, and then also the sort of activist documentary, which is just about getting it out to a specific target audience at a specific time, and then sort of, that's the sort of purpose of it. That's sort of all I can think of.